Okay, this is lesson 3.04, Confronting the Crisis, referring, of course, to the crisis of the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt came into the presidency from a privileged and pampered background. His wealth in early life led many to believe he had little substance. In fact, his easy manner masked his quick intelligence. Roosevelt had promised the American people a New Deal, but now he needed to implement new programs that convinced the public to be patient and hopeful about their potential effectiveness. He used the radio to talk to the American people in fireside chats. Millions of people listened to every word the president had to say. Goals for this lesson. Describe the first 100 days of FDR's administration. Assess the goals and effects of key legislation passed during the first 100 days. Identify key elements of President Roosevelt's background and rise to the presidency. Be sure to grab your reading guide and lesson answer key. And let's begin. Okay, we're going to start with reading pages 686 through 695. All right. On a gray Saturday morning in March 1933, a somber crowd of 100,000 spectators gathered in Washington, D.C. to see Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt of New York sworn in as President of the United States. Millions more listened by radio, hoping for some message to calm their anxieties and restore their shattered hopes. Not since the Civil War had so many Americans felt so fearful. The nation's economy was in ruins. Banks were collapsing. Unemployed men crisscrossed the country on freight trains in search of work. In the cities, jobless factory workers scrounged in alleys for rotten produce. In the country, families scavenged dried up fields for edible roots. People looked to the new president with high hopes. The comedian Will Rogers said that Americans were ready to follow Roosevelt anywhere. If he burned down the Capitol, he would either cheer and say, well, at least we got a fire started anyhow. After taking the oath of office, Roosevelt delivered his inaugural address. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper, he declared. He went on to encourage Americans with a statement that now lives in memory. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Roosevelt knew that people wanted action and action now, and he promised to deliver it. We have nothing to fear but fear itself is a very famous quote that you maybe have heard sometime in your life already, or if not, now you've heard it. In Europe, the global depression was undermining democratic governments and lifting dictators to power. But Americans got a new kind of democratic leader, a bold, clever politician who redefined government's role and rekindled Americans' faith in the future. Some citizens thought he went too far. They argued that the Roosevelt Revolution gave too much power to the federal government and compromised the rugged individualism on which the United States had been built. But many others thought that Roosevelt saved the American system by reforming it. Whether they approved or disapproved of the new president, few people could deny that he forever changed the relationship between Americans and their government. The New Deal, Roosevelt's array of programs and initiatives to pull the United States out of the Great Depression, was a major turning point into the nation's political development. Roosevelt becomes a leader. During the 1932 presidential campaign, the influential newspaper columnist Walter Lippmann called Franklin Roosevelt a pleasant man who, without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president. A distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin struck many observers as unprepared for high office. One critic sniped that he was only one half of 1% Roosevelt. Born into a very wealthy family, FDR grew up in a palatial estate at Hyde Park, New York. He glided through the elite private schools. He went on to graduate from Harvard University and attended Columbia University Law School until he passed the bar examination in 1907. He built a successful legal practice largely on the strength of his wealth, connections, and charm. In many ways, Roosevelt was an easy man to underestimate, but his broad smile and chatty demeanor masked fierce ambition, an encyclopedic mind, and a shrewd feel for people in power. He earned praise as a reformer in the New York State Senate and then in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet, where he served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. In 1920, he was chosen as the Democratic nominee for vice president. The Democrats lost, but at the age of 38, Roosevelt seemed destined for big things. Just as Roosevelt's star was rising, tragedy struck. In the summer of 1921, he contracted polio and was left paralyzed from the waist down. Most people assumed he was finished in politics, but he refused to give in. For 7 years, FDR struggled to recover from his paralysis. Though he never regained the ability to walk, he developed remarkable upper body strength. Wearing heavy and always concealed steel braces on his legs, he developed a method of locking arms with 2 assistants, one on each side, and swinging his legs in a walking motion. In this manner, he was able to appear before large audiences without revealing the full extent of his condition. And let's read this short excerpt on polio. Polio was one of the most feared diseases of the 20th century. It struck without warning, killing some of its victims and paralyzing others, leaving them confined to wheelchairs or leg braces. Although people of all ages could contract polio, Franklin Roosevelt was stricken when he was 39. It often afflicted children, especially in the summer months. The disease was sometimes called infantile paralysis. After FDR's time, researchers found a way to prevent polio. In 1948, Jonas Salk identified 3 types of poliovirus in his lab at the University of Pittsburgh. He eventually developed a vaccine to protect against the disease. In 1954, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, now called the March of Dimes Foundation, became a nationwide test of Salk's vaccine. Nearly 2 million school children lined up for injections. The vaccine proved highly effective. Over the next 4 years, doctors and nurses administered some 450 million doses of the vaccine. The dreaded disease began to disappear from much of the world. Okay, let's turn the page. When the chance came in 1928 to return to public life, FDR ran for the governorship of New York and won. People who had previously thought of him as a privileged, superficial man now found him more compassionate and serious. In overcoming his own challenges, Roosevelt developed a deep empathy for the most unfortunate in society. As governor, Roosevelt advanced progressive ideas that the Republican presidents of the 1920s had discarded. He enacted state measures to aid the unemployed. After winning a second 2-year term in 1930, he set his sights on the White House. In a time of financial crisis, with Americans desperate for new leadership, Roosevelt easily defeated incumbent President Herbert Hoover. FDR's New Deal. In 1933, many people proposed many ideas about how to fix the economy. Roosevelt assembled what he called his Brain Trust, a group of economists, political scientists, and lawyers to help him devise a program of bold, persistent experimentation. The president wanted action, and he wanted it quickly. It is common sense to take a method and try it, he said during the campaign, but if it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. The 100 Days. The first few months of the new president's administration, known as the 100 Days, were perhaps the most astonishingly productive period of executive and legislative action in American history. No single economic theory united its initiatives, but all reflected Roosevelt's belief that a country raised on rugged individualism must now understand that no one could get out of this mess on its own. The nation had changed. Industrialization, urbanization, and national markets had made Americans deeply interdependent. Therefore, as Roosevelt saw it, businessmen, farmers, workers, all would need to cooperate under the government's guiding hand. As for the long-held attitude of laissez-faire, the idea that government should leave the economy alone, FDR told an aide, if that philosophy hadn't proved bankrupt, Herbert Hoover would be sitting here right now. The new president called on Congress to emergency session and then moved on multiple fronts to meet the unprecedented challenges of the Great Depression. Main themes of the New Deal. Because the New Deal was flexible and experimental, historians have found it difficult to summarize the driving idea behind the array of programs and initiatives. Even some of the president's close advisors found the task difficult. An economist who served as a close advisor to FDR later admitted, "I really do not know what the basic principle of the New Deal is." Nevertheless, the 3 main themes characterize the New Deal, and you will need to know these themes. Relief. The 3 R's, relief, recovery, reform. Relief, providing money to ensure that unemployed people have basic necessities and creating jobs to put people back to work. Recovery, national planning to get the economy moving again. And reform, new laws to restructure the institution like banks, change labor relations, and create new social programs with the goal of making American capitalism more stable and fair. So the 3 R's of the Great Depression, of the New Deal, relief, recovery, reform. Remember them. Chart showing U.S. unemployment from 1929 to 1942. Rise, rise, rise. It goes down a little bit there again, rising again, falling again. Seeing it's tracking up and down. Some programs aimed at just one of these goals, some more than one, and some, especially the reform programs, were controversial. Saving the banks. With the banking system in free fall, Roosevelt promptly declared a bank holiday, a clever term for a total shutdown of the banks. This allowed the president's aides to organize a plan to reorganize the banking system. Congress quickly approved the administration's Emergency Banking Act, which gave the president extensive powers to close failing banks and reopen those deemed financially sound. Most banks reopened within about a week, and the president set Americans' minds at ease by announcing that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress. Following up legislation created Follow-up legislation created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, an agency to insure the bank deposits of individuals and businesses. And you'll almost, when you see any ads for banks, it will always say FDIC insured, and that's to ensure that you will not lose your savings. If something happens to the bank, your savings is insured. Any money you have in the bank, you will be able to get back, which was not happening before this. That's why so many people lost their life savings when banks failed. Roosevelt's measures restored people's confidence that their bank deposits were safe. Consequently, many people stopped making panicky withdrawals and instead deposited or left their money in banks. With money in their vaults, the banks were able to resume lending. By applying the promise of federal assistance, FDR stabilized the banking system at little cost to the taxpayers. His actions reflected his belief that only the government could regulate and stabilize a complex economy. This belief would shape many of his New Deal proposals. Helping the jobless. When FDR took office, millions of jobless citizens were scraping by on handouts from churches, charities, and dwindling local relief funds. Some were literally starving. FDR's predecessor, Herbert Hoover, a believer in rugged individualism, had vetoed legislation that proposed direct relief payments from the federal government. Roosevelt, however, believed that the federal government had a moral duty to help struggling families. To this end, the administration released $500 million, the equivalent of over $8 billion today, to the states for grants, loans, and jobs for the unemployed. The new funds helped set up various programs, including the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, initially putting 250,000 to work. Over the course of 10 years, the CCC employed more than 2 million young men to plant trees, fight forest fires, and improve national parks. Here's a picture of working at the CCC. The government also established a Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. With banks foreclosing on mortgages at the rate of $1,000 a day, this new agency stepped in to help about 1 million families who were faced with loss of their homes. The HOLC brought the mortgages from the banks and then offered families new loans with mortgage payments they could afford, thus allowing them to keep their homes. Aiding the countryside. After banking, no sector of the economy was in worse shape than agriculture. As agricultural surpluses grew ever higher, prices dropped ever lower. In the summer of 1932, desperate Midwestern farmers blocked delivery trucks and dumped milk in ditches to try to limit supply and thus increase prices. Roosevelt proposed a farm relief plan based on essentially the same idea, to limit supplies and thus drive up prices. FDR's Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, paid subsidies to farmers who agreed to take some of their acreage out of production. Many people criticized a policy that limited or even destroyed crops while Americans were going hungry. But as production decreased, prices did rise and the farm crisis eased slightly. During his struggle with polio, Roosevelt has spent many months exercising in the mineral waters at Warm Spring, Georgia, where he witnessed the poverty of rural South firsthand. As president, he proposed a vast project to build hydroelectric dams that would harness power from America's rivers and streams. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, approved by Congress in 1933, authorized the building of several new dams and improvements to dozens of existing dams. The dams protected the region from devastating floods, and through hydroelectric power, the TVA project supplied parts of 7 states with cheap electricity. By using the region's waterways to electrify and modernize part of the rural South, the TVA represented Roosevelt's belief that the government had a responsibility to put America's natural resources to productive use for as many people as possible. Planning for industry. From 1929 to 1933, factory production dropped by almost half, and construction and all but ground to a halt. New Dealers, who believed that government must take the lead in reviving business and industry, passed the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, which authorized every industry and trade, from coal mining to retail to barbering, to agree on how much to produce, how much to pay workers, and how much to charge for their products. The policy reversed the antitrust tradition of the Progressive era, but FDR's advisors hoped it might spur recovery of prices, wages, and eventually employment. The NIRA set up a new government agency, the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, to assist businesses in their efforts. Though the NRA failed to revive American manufacturing and the Supreme Court later found it to be unconstitutional, it gave further evidence of Roosevelt's intent to use the full force of government to reorganize the American economy. On June 16th, an exhausted Congress adjourned after approving 15 major pieces of legislation in 103 days. Not every initiative worked, and President lost some supporters along the way. Nevertheless, 100 days, as one of the brain trusters said later, was a time of rebirth after a dark age.